Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual panel discussion hosted by the Atlantic Council. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO. First, I would like to give a special welcome to the many board members we have on this call, and we hope to be joined as well by our chairman, John Rogers. As you all know, the coronavirus is a health crisis and an economic emergency. You've seen from the Atlantic Council over the last 2 weeks, and this marks our second full week. Today marks our second full week of telework. And the staff, the team of the Atlantic Council is ramped up in record time, with really good technological response as well, to keep you all informed across the health issues of this and across the political issues of this. Today and going forward, our Global Business and Economics program is going to ramp up to keep you abreast of the global financial and global economic issues, and of course the national ones as well. And speed is going to be our key word. Ann Lowry from The Atlantic wrote last week, quote, "No one alive has experienced an economic plunge this fast. What's happening is a shock to the American economy, more sudden and severe than anyone alive has ever experienced," she said. Carmen Reinhardt, Harvard University economist, said the global economy hasn't looked fragile since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The timing of this call is also very good in the sense that it comes with the stimulus package from Congress, so we can attempt to answer the question, is it enough? What else might come? It's also coming after the G20 meeting yesterday, where one can also look there. Is it enough? The spirit of connectedness doesn't seem to be as great as it was in 2009, but could there be more to come? We have just the right people on this line to start the conversation. I'm particularly delighted that Jason Furman has joined us, one of the architects of the 2009 recovery, so he can make the comparisons. Alexis Crow from PwC, a wonderful expert that we've worked with very closely. Alexis, it's great to have you here. And Hung Tran, a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, who has joined us as well and is quite an expert on the G20, so he'll be able to speak to that and other issues. Nothing, however, gives me more pleasure than to hand things over to Josh Lipsky. So Josh is the new director, and when I say new, I mean really new, this Monday, the new director of programs and policy at our Global Business and Economics program, and thus you're going to see a real ramp up now. And any of you who have joined new organizations, the first week is always a time when you're growing accustomed to things, but you can imagine that this is a little bit different of a first week than most people have. He's come to us from the IMF, where he was a right hand to Christine Lagarde for communications, speech writing, and other issues. He's been at the White House, he's been at the State Department, and he was an intern at the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. So expect some innovations from the Atlantic Council. With that, Josh, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Atlantic Council and to hand over to you for your inaugural event.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, everyone who's been so welcoming this week. And I'm very excited and honored to be part of the Atlantic Council, to be working on these issues at such a critical moment for the global economy. And as you said, it's just the beginning of what we're going to be doing here in the weeks and months ahead. So stay tuned, as they say. We're going to actually go a little longer than planned today. We're going to go close to an hour because we've had so much interest and already questions coming in for this event. And you can submit your questions in 3 ways. So Zoom, through the Q&A function, through the chat, please send them in that way. We already see a couple. Through Twitter, using the hashtag fiscal firepower. And if you're on Facebook, you can post right to the live stream. So we'll be curating and we'll be asking our panelists these questions. Fred did it very nicely, and I'll just officially introduce our panel really quickly. Dr. Jason Furman, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors during President Obama's second term, and deputy director of the National Economic Council in President Obama's first term. And as Fred said, he took a lead in crafting the Recovery Act. So we're going to talk about that today. Dr. Alexis Crow leads the geopolitical investing practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers. She's a senior fellow at Columbia, and we are proud to say also a senior fellow with us at the Atlantic Council. And Dr. Hung Tran, also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, former executive managing director of the International Institute of Finance, and former deputy director at the IMF, my recent former home. So we have three doctors, none of them here to talk about the health crisis, all here to talk about the economic crisis. And let's get right to it. So Jason, you've been ahead of this situation for a month. I read a piece, I think it was almost a month ago now exactly. You were calling for direct payments. You said send checks, put money in people's pockets. We don't have time for targeting. And that at the time wasn't really a mainstream or widely accepted view on either side of the aisle. But in a few hours, that's likely what's going to become law. And we can go through the numbers together. But the bottom line is that many Americans are going to get $1,200 checks. There's $500 billion in the package for lending to business, and that's just part of the deal. So can you set the baseline for us here? What's your overall assessment of the package? And as someone who helped draft the Recovery Act, can you put the perspective of both the speed and the size of this into a little clarity for us?
Great. So thanks so much to the Atlantic Council for organizing, Fred for introducing, and Josh, welcome. Things have moved incredibly rapidly. I'm actually impressed by how much Washington has done, how quickly it has done it, how comprehensively it has done it, and worried that all of that won't be enough for a virus and an economy that is shutting down in such an unprecedented way. To put a little bit of perspective on this, Josh was kind. I was, I think, one of the early people talking about the need for an accelerated, big, comprehensive, and dynamic response. I was invited in to talk to the House caucus, let me see, a little bit more than 2 weeks ago. And there were people in that room talking about the need to do $100 billion of stimulus, which they viewed as large. There were people who weren't sure whether the problem was related to OPEC or coronavirus. There were people who were talking about putting an infrastructure bill on the floor in May. That has changed incredibly rapidly. Just to give you two little anecdotes that give you a window into that, during the financial crisis, our first meeting with Congress on the Recovery Act was on December 17th, 2008. The Recovery Act was signed into law 2 months later on February 17th, 2009. That was about $800 billion. And the negotiation was between a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate at the time of an urgent national emergency. This legislation came together in a little bit over a week. It was the product of divided government, done under very imperfect conditions with everyone working remotely. It's twice as large. In the Recovery Act, we did something unprecedented. We said, if you're on unemployment insurance, we're going to give you extra money. We're going to give you an extra $25 every week. This legislation followed that precedent from the Recovery Act, except instead of $25, it's $600. And that type of multiple is something we're seeing throughout this process. We're seeing it at the Fed, which is doing operations in a single day, the equivalent of what it did in a month or months in the financial crisis. We're seeing it in fiscal policy. The question is, will it be enough? We know how sharp the contraction is now. The big question is how persistent that contraction is. There's 5 factors I'd think about. One is just the general dynamics of business cycles. Unemployment rates can go up quickly. They never go down quickly. There's an asymmetry in business cycles. V-shaped recoveries are very, very rare. The second is what shape are consumer balance sheets in at the end of this. I think the legislation does a good job of that with the payments, a good job of that with unemployment insurance, but we're going to need to expand those. Number 3, are businesses intact at the end of this and ready to be revived? That's certainly the intention of the small business lending facility. I worry about the speed with which that money will get out. I worry about the size of the fund, and I also worry that there'll be some windfalls along the way. On the big business side, it's not self-executing. It depends on what the Fed does with it and how effectively they use it. Fourth is the financial system. Is that intact at the end of this? It went into this with relatively healthy capital. The Fed is doing just extraordinary things to keep that market functioning. I think we should be able to prevent this from becoming a financial crisis. So I feel better on that score. Finally, the global ramifications. This is happening all over the world. Global supply chains, emerging market debt and current account crises, sudden stops, and the like. How will those reverberate around the world? I'd sort of end by saying it's possible this will be like one huge natural disaster and we bounce right back. It's possible to be like a financial crisis with a prolonged recovery. I think policy is doing an awful lot to help make it more like a natural disaster and less like a financial crisis, but it may be that there is no policy that can deal with an economy that was, had to be shut down this abruptly for this long a period of time.
Thank you, Jason. The size has been talked about a lot, but the speed point is just as important as you bring up, because thinking of the difference between November, December to February versus a week timeline now, I know there's been a lot of criticism of Congress, but as you said, there have to be credit where credit's due, and this was done rapidly done by all comparisons. So thank you for making that point. Alexis, let me turn to you. We spoke a little bit about this yesterday. I'm curious if you agree with Jason's overall assessment, but I'm also curious, looking at Europe, which you focus on as well, because their fiscal response has been a little different. I'm thinking of Denmark, I'm thinking of the UK. There's more of a focus there on keeping employees on employer payrolls. And obviously that's very costly, but they're approaching it a little differently. And I'm wondering what you're seeing across Europe, or at least the different reactions.
Sure, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, and just wishing everybody a very safe time throughout all of this health crisis. I think the first thing to point out is, as Jason highlighted, we're dealing with a health crisis at the moment, which has obviously turned into an economic crisis. And I think everyone's doing the best they can to prevent it from becoming a financial crisis. And I would say that what we've seen in responses around the world, I've been looking at this for several months, first with the Chinese outbreak and then following across to Italy, understanding the severity of it. I think some people were thinking in slightly myopic terms and slightly already isolated terms that this wouldn't impact and have spillover effects in terms of the health crisis or in terms of the economic crisis. So that's what I've seen is a common theme to call out, I think, with regard to the firstly, the monetary policy responses, and then fiscal would be a drop to a trickle to a torrent. And that's what we've seen in terms of numbers. Jason mentioned the 100 billion. Some of the numbers I've seen come out of Downing Street had to be ripped up. Obviously, we've seen the ECB come in a way, in a sort of waterfall way after the first few trickles, as befits the economic crisis. I would agree. I think there's very little we can do to prevent an economic crisis. And some of the reasons why are because this is hitting the real economy. It's not banks, going back to where we were in mortgage lending in 2008. So today, when we look at what one of my favorite writers called the grimmest chart that, that's come out of the crisis is the 3.3 million jobless claims yesterday in the US. That is the real economy. So if we look at, strictly speaking, you have 20% of employment in the US today. You have about 161 million employed people, 10% in retail as a conservative definition, and 10% in leisure and hospitality. So the claims that you could have 20% unemployment rate are not far-fetched at all. So I think that also justifies the amount historically never been seen before, as well as the speed. And again, I think it's going to be very difficult to avoid an economic crisis. I would just call out, I think, bridging from the US to Europe, I think a crucial distinction here is the ability to be able to hold workers in their positions, potentially furloughed, or in France, you have chômage partiel, which is already part of the labor law, where you can reduce hours and help support workers and keep them in their roles. Why? Because this is a sudden economic stop. I have been very wary of the elusive V-shaped recovery. I think a V-shaped recovery is definitely far too optimistic. But when we do recover, the ability to have companies have workers maintained in employment and productivity to resume productivity is going to be absolutely crucially important to generating economic growth going forward. And so when we look at past historical responses to crises, putting cash in the pockets of unemployed, of consumers, wearing cognizant of the fact that 70% of GDP growth in the US comes from consumers, I think the ultimate impact has to be to focus on workers. And so what I would say there are culturally different transatlantic responses to this. The US, in a typically more laissez-faire approach, has said, okay, we're going to kind of continue on in the way that we have done. In Europe, I think being led by Germany, where the stakeholder agreement came, from whence it came, and going back to Ferdinand Toynes, I would say that the Kurzarbeit, the ability to be able to pay to workers and to companies that have been either temporarily suspended or reduced in terms of their hours, has been executed with ease in Germany. We have data on that going back to the last great financial crisis. I'm hearing differences of bureaucracy in the Netherlands, where it's slightly more difficult. I think Bruno Le Maire is taking everything he can to this crisis in France. What I have seen some other promising signs are 4 billion euros to be able to continue to help support French startups, which I think has been fantastic given the growth of startups post-Brexit in France and really becoming the startup capital of Europe. So what we've seen are clear national fiscal responses in the European side of things. I think with regard to the EU-wide responses, we are seeing some of the traditional cultural impasses with regard to things like Eurobonds and the ESM arise. So we've seen Dutch Financial Minister Hoekstra actually talk about, kind of concern around the use of the ESM, that it's too early. That brings me going back to the GFC, which I'm sure Jason can talk about, there's hindsight 2020 of when should we step in, what was too big to fail. And then I'm also seeing Altmaier in Germany with some concern around the use of Eurobonds at the moment. Of course, I think you're seeing dissent between Frankfurt and Brussels, Frankfurt and Rome and Brussels and Rome on this. And I would just kind of conclude with a note of saying that, we've seen the Draghi refrain and reprise spoken over and over again by leaders to do whatever it takes. And I think that's a common refrain for everyone. But I would just emphasize this crucial distinction has to be able to maintain workers in terms of their employment.
Thank you, Alexis. So I'll take a point of personal privilege on the Draghi refrain. What I see happening, what I believe happening, is that my former boss, Christine Lagarde, is living it in practice right now. Obviously, there was some difficult moments in the early days, but I think some of the extraordinary measures that ECB are taking and will continue to take in the days ahead are putting the Draghi refrain into practice. But more to be done, clearly. But so, Hung, let me turn to you on the broader global picture. The G20 met virtually yesterday. Saudi Arabia is in the chair. It was a kind of extraordinary meeting just to see the 20 leaders on the different boxes on screen. And, what came out of that, my takeaway was a commitment to $5 trillion of stimulus, which is the same commitment that was made in 2009. And you wrote an excellent piece on this last week, laying out what the G20 needed to do. Do you think they did what they needed to do?
Thank you, Josh. My remarks will be centering around the G20, but also at the end about what they can do to support the IMF to be more helpful and effective particularly to the emerging market countries. First, the G20 statement, I think it is better than my low expectation base case scenario, but it should have and could have been more ambitious. So let me go through some specific points. Number one, the leaders said that they are strongly committed to present a united front against the common threat. And I think that is a very clear, unequivocal statement, which is timely and needed at the moment. And beyond that, they also go into some details about agreeing to share information, data about research against the pandemic, expanding production of medical supplies, and make them available, and I quote, widely available at affordable prices in an equitable way to where it is needed, which is, I think, very pointed and very timely to push against the action of some countries starting to put export control on medical equipment. That's number one. And I think in terms of statement, it is as good as we can get at this point, and let's see how they continue to practice it. Number two, they really take a step in the right direction, small step, but clearly in the right direction on trade. They agree to ensure flow of medical supplies, critical agricultural products, and other goods and services across borders. And in that light, the USTR Trade Representative Office plans to reduce tariffs on medical equipment and supplies. And China, over the past 2 months, have cut several tariffs on a range of goods. They are tiny steps, but in the right direction. And I wish that they could do more going forward. One disappointment which Josh highlighted is that they mentioned countries have injected $5 trillion, same amount as in 2009. Two things to remember. One, it is done piecemeally by individual countries and not in a united way like in 2009. And second, it is very unevenly contributed. The US is far ahead. And if the 2.2 trillion omnibus bill passed the House today, that will put the US into something like 10 to 14% of GDP in terms of fiscal stimulus. That variation depends on how to count the direct demand stimulation against the guarantees contained in the bill. But anyway, way ahead. Compared with China, 0.8% so far, they really need to step up and do more. In the EU, like Alexis says, they have done it on a country-by-country basis. Individual accounts average 2% of GDP. No joint action from the EU. They clearly need to do more, and so on. So that is one area where we should see more. The next thing is that they really express grave concern for the less developed and low-income countries and pledges support for the IMF, which lead me to the second point about what should be done to support the IMF. There's a whole issue before I go on with the IMF. There's the whole issue of turmoil and disorderly behavior in the foreign exchange markets, reflecting the rush for dollar funding. And I think that another thing that the G20 can begin to discuss is to see how they can have a concerted foreign exchange markets intervention to smooth and to prevent the dollar from rising too much and putting even more pressure on the emerging market countries. So that leads me to the second area of IMF. As we speak, the IMFC, the International Monetary and Financial Committee, is meeting. They are the ruling body of the IMF. And among the items they decide today is to address the request by the new managing director for doubling the fund's emergency financing capacity, currently at 50 billion to 100 billion. And I think that is urgently needed because 80 countries have already applied for those lines. Those are emergency fast dispersing facility requiring very low conditionality so that can be used very quickly. The managing director also requests approval to double the SDR special drawing right allocation, doubling the amount done in 2009 to 500 billion. I think this is something that can be done fairly quickly because in the US, administration can just do it without congressional approval because the allocation is below the quota of the US. And last but not least, in the 2 trillion omnibus bill, there's some small money earmarked there to double the new arrangement to borrow the NAP. that the US should really leverage it more and take a leadership role in pushing all the G20 countries to do that. Basically, at this point, to raise capacity of the fund to show support to the IMF, send a clear message of international cooperation to help the emerging market countries. And last point is the need for debt relief or moratorium on debt services on the part of the low-income and poorest country. The IMF and the World Bank jointly issue a call for some moratorium to the International Development Association, IDA, member countries, 76 of them. For this year, they have a $40 billion of debt servicing payment for this year, 18 billion of which is to bilateral country creditors. The joint call is really addressed to the moratorium from the bilateral creditors, but I think it should be expanded to include all creditors, including private sector creditors, to set a framework and process to do this. Otherwise, we will face with going forward a series of sovereign debt defaults in a disorderly way, which will hurt market sentiment even more. So I stop here and happy to join the discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate all of that. And on the IMF, I agree with you fully. $1 trillion is not enough. I mean, just to put it bluntly. And it may have felt like enough 3 weeks ago, but that's the changing nature of the situation. When I was at the IMF a week ago, they had 20 program countries asking for additional assistance. 4 days later, it was 40 countries. Then 3 days, it was 60 countries. Now it's above 90, so half the membership, essentially, of the IMF. Just gives you a sense of the rapidly expanding nature of the economic crisis globally. Jason, I want to come back to you, and I want to dig into the stimulus a little bit with you. So I have a couple questions, and I want to go through some different provisions. But can we start with the direct aid to states here? I think there's about 150 billion in the package. I think most folks, I want to hear your take, would agree that's not enough. So I'm wondering what you think needs to happen on the state component in phase 4. And then more broadly, when are we going to see phase 4? What's the timeline for that? And will the economic data that comes out in the coming weeks push to even further action? So if we could talk about that, and then I want to talk about unemployment insurance.
Yeah, so I think the most clear-cut lack in the stimulus bill that is about to be passed is assistance to states. And you have to understand that states have two things going on at once. One is their emergency-related expenditures are going up. The second is that their revenue is plummeting. The bill provides $150 billion to cover those emergency expenditures, which is very good and very important. It doesn't provide any general support, though, to handle the revenue decline. That revenue decline, you lose about $40 billion of state revenue for every percentage point the unemployment rate rises. If you say the unemployment rate rises by 5 percentage points, I think that would be quite optimistic. That gets you to $200 billion. And states have balanced budget requirements. They have to balance within a year. By delaying tax payments at the federal level, it's going to delay tax payments collections at the local level. And so just to continue to pay teachers, keep the lights on, not have a fiscal contraction, some broader support for states, either earmarked through their Medicaid program, which is still somewhat fungible, or just entirely unrestricted money at a much larger scale is definitely going to be needed. In terms of when that fourth bill comes together, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows.
So let me go into two other components of the bill. The first, and we've got some questions on this, is on unemployment insurance. One of the things I found interesting, I think other folks found interesting, was that freelance workers, part-time workers are now going to be eligible in a way they hadn't been before. And so I'm sort of wondering for your take on that. And one of the questions we got was, is this going to sort of indicate a more structural way we think about unemployment insurance in this country after the crisis?
Yeah, so the unemployment insurance system was developed in the 1930s. It is administered by the states The tax revenue is effectively mostly collected by the federal government with a lot of complicated intergovernmental exchanges. A lot of the system, we modernized it some in 2009 in the Recovery Act, but much of it is still creaky. Creaky in terms of rules, not accommodating ways our economy has changed, like gig workers, and creaky in terms of being run over phone systems rather than computers, and capable of handling volume, making rapid changes. That inadequacy, and that, by the way, is the American social safety net in general. We don't have paid leave, for example. We don't have mandatory sick leave. And so relative to some of the European countries, we've had to almost invent new parts of our social safety net that we wish had been there before this and weren't. And inventing them at a time like this is a very, very imperfect way to do it, but probably better than not even trying. The systems place constraints. For example, would have loved to have raised what's called the replacement rate. Say unemployment insurance will give you 85% of your previous wages or 90% of your previous wages or something like that. The computers couldn't be reprogrammed to do that. So instead it does this somewhat clunky, whatever you were going to get, you get that plus $600 because the computers can be programmed to do addition. They can't be programmed to do more complicated calculations. The gig workers, that's something that we've done before in disasters, administered jointly by FEMA and states through something called Disaster UI. It's now being expanded incredibly rapidly at a national level. I do hope that some of that will be a permanent change that we see coming out of this. The $600 does not make sense permanently. It's an emergency measure, but things like gig workers, they should have been in unemployment insurance before. And maybe we'll get some reforms to our social safety net around unemployment, paid leave, and the like around this crisis.
Thank you. And one more question on the package, and then I'm going to turn back to Alexis. But folks, please keep sending in questions. We're getting good ones. Remember, on Zoom, you can send in the Q&A, and on Twitter, you can use hashtag fiscal firepower. On the package, the $500 billion lending to businesses, I was wondering if you could talk about a little. You were part of that in 2009, and then some of the backlash. I was in the White House then. You remember some of the statements made about we're not going to do bailouts again. Is this a bailout? How is it different? How is it going to be administered different? And what is the watchdog element really going to look like?
Yeah. So this is pretty close to no strings attached money to capitalize Federal Reserve programs that could easily be 10 times as large as it. The Fed doesn't want to take risks with its own money, appropriately so. This is essentially money that was appropriated for that purpose. When you look at TARP, that had a $700 billion headline. Ex post, on banks, it made a profit. And on net, not counting the housing programs, which were grant programs, it made a profit. And almost no one understands that. They look back and think TARP was this big, horrible gift to banks. And they don't realize it was essentially making money from banks at a time when the federal government had deeper pockets and more patience. The banks desperately needed the money and gave the federal government a profit in exchange for it. This time around, do I think we'll make a profit on that $500 billion? I think it's probably going to be harder to. If we lose 10 or 20% of it and do a lot of benefit for the economy in the process, I certainly think that's worth it. You set up a lending program now and you have 10 or 20% default rate. I don't think that's so terrible. That might be what we need to do. But I do think that I'm worried that when the dust starts to settle, there'll be a lot of public anger around all of this and what everyone went through. They'll see companies that have done perfectly well. There will be cases of companies that got a windfall from this. That is inevitable, and that is going to happen when you try to rescue at this speed. And what the public attitude towards sort of wartime profiteering and the like, whether it's real or in many cases I think will be not real but perceived, will I think have ramifications that last for some time.
Thank you. So Alexis, let me turn back to you now. And you wrote a piece this morning on emerging markets. And I think that's been a sort of misunderstood and undercovered part of this story. We know that EMs were, at least a few of them were under significant stress before the coronavirus crisis, South Africa, Argentina, of course. And so I'm wondering what you're seeing now. Obviously, we saw the highest outflow of capital that I think the IIF had ever recorded in its history, just in a few-week period. So what's happening really in EMs in terms of liquidity, and what are their options in terms of monetary policy and fiscal responses right now?
Thank you. I will just actually call out, I think it's important to note that in bringing out the bazookas and all of these individual fiscal responses, monetary policy, I would call out three key vulnerabilities in the global economy that have been building out hitherto Corona crisis. One would be leverage loans in the US. So looking at the extraordinary increase in BBB- rated debt on non-financial corporate balance sheets. The energy sector is obviously one sector that's bled out. The second would be European banking fragility. And the third would be US dollar denominated debt sitting on non-financial corporate balance sheets, as well as an increase to sovereign borrowing costs. So with that I think those vulnerabilities existed before. We're seeing, I think there's a little bit of a pause, but I think those will come under duress, and they could be examples of companies that were not necessarily very responsible leading up to Corona crisis. But as Jason said, you could see some public anger that as a result of that fiscal irresponsibility, they've been bailed out rather than being directly impacted by the crisis. On emerging markets, I would say obviously what we're seeing now, as Hung hinted at some of the multilateral development banks, an overwhelming response to be able to help to stem the health crisis. And in countries such as India, Modi has made it a priority to be able to get food to people so that people do not go hungry. That's a very different situation than where I'm sitting in Brooklyn, where the shelves of very chic grocery stores sell out for a couple of days and then everything's back there. There's no scarcity. So I think that's the key thing to be able to point out. Bangladesh, I would say as well. I think in terms of capital flows, you hinted at the IIF's figure, which Robin Brooks and his colleagues have called unprecedented. What I would say, obviously, in terms of capital flows is that when China sneezes, the rest of EMs catch a flu. And when commodity prices go down, the rest of EMs catch a flu. It's guilty by association, which obviously creates significant opportunities for investors across the board in liquid markets. Now what we've seen is this unprecedented outflows from equities and fixed income. What I would say is that in terms of fiscal space, you're seeing an expansion of the fiscal deficit across the board to be able to do two things: to stem the health crisis and also to shore up certain segments of the economy that have been impacted. Malaysia is an economy to note that has been stepping in to be able to support the tourism sector. Singapore is another one to be able to step in and support the tourism sector. Vietnam has been forward thinking in terms of just looking at its nascent capital markets, putting discounts on transactions to be able to shore up liquidity. So you're seeing, I think, very proactive responses to be able to stem the economic crisis. Where I think you see duress, Josh, you highlighted, I think there's some, when I work with clients on EMs, it's like there's some country-specific problem children that I wouldn't put a dime into that have their own country-specific issues. And I won't name names, but those have been, I think, also guilty of being able to bring down the whole EM asset class as a whole by association rather than absolute risk for some of the other economies. What you have seen prior to Corona crisis was a number of economies actually implementing macroprudential measures, going back to the Asian flu, going back to the GFC. So moving from fixed to floating exchange rate, reducing the fiscal deficit, bolstering up foreign exchange reserves. So all of these being able to be resilient against potential macro shocks, which I think has been very positive. But now, of course, what we see is, I think, probably following on the heels of a lot of the capital outflows in liquid markets will be a pause in alternative asset investing. at the moment, while I think a lot of investors are focused on their home turf, their organizations, their own liquidity, and their portfolio companies, but then again, looking to the opportunity for potential dislocation. Hung, and I'll hand to him, wrote a great piece on dollar liquidity and the stress on dollar liquidity that impacts countries like Brazil with their foreign exchange reserves and the dollar swap mechanism. What I would say is I'm crucially focused on some of these non-financial corporate balance sheets, $31 trillion worth of leverage and EMs for companies today. And I think that's we're only likely to see stress and duress and some forced selling, particularly as you see imported inflation from a rise in the USD.
Thank you. And Hung, I'm going to come to dollar liquidity, and we have actually a few questions about the IMF resources in a second. But the one question we're getting overwhelmingly on social media, and I want to turn to Jason and then ask everyone for their quick takes on this, is what do you think about this argument that the cure is worse than the disease? This is obviously what we've been hearing the last few days in the US. And Jason, I know you've been highlighting on Twitter a paper about the Spanish flu that actually kind of looks at this issue a little bit. So this is the number one question we're getting. And Jason, I'd love to hear from you first, and then we'd love to hear from everybody.
Sure. So let me read you from a statement that I co-signed. I'll tell you some of the other signatories after. Saving lives and saving the economy are not in conflict right now. We will hasten the return to robust economic activity by taking steps to stem the spread of the virus and save lives. That statement was signed by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, Josh Bolton, who's the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable, David Cody, a former business leader, Ben Bernanke, Glenn Hubbard, Greg Mankiw, Neil Kashkari, et cetera, et cetera. There was a recent paper that Josh mentioned by some economists at the Fed that studied cities and what they did in the Spanish flu. And it found that places that took more drastic actions to shut down their economies had much better economies a year or two later, and also had better health outcomes. Do I think there's never any trade-off between the economy and health? Definitely there's sometimes a trade-off. When we make pollution rules, when we make rules on speed limits, when we make all sorts of rules in our economy, we have to assess the cost per life saved. We have to do that in a really hard-headed manner. Right now, though, is not one of those times. If you if you make the social distancing more intense, if you continue it a little bit longer, you will not just save lives, you will put the economy in a place where it can eventually recover in a better way, because you can't run an economy with massively overloaded hospitals, morgues, a very high death rate. And by the way, even if the country isn't shut down, a lot of people and businesses would still shut down in that circumstance. So I think this is very much a situation where doing something larger and more intense now to buy time can help you later. At some point, we will have a trade-off between the economies and lives. We will need to be hard-headed about that trade-off, but we're not there. I don't think we're even, I'd be pleasantly surprised if we were a month away from that type of tough trade-off.
Alexis, can I get you to respond to that?
Yeah, I've seen a great statement that the way to increase GDP per capita is not to eliminate per capita. And I would highly agree. I think that saving human lives is the utmost priority at the moment. And all of the data goes to show that very sharp, aggressive social distancing, isolation, quarantining shows an impact to be able to stem the cases. So I think that's highly important. It's also tied to this. This policy point to be able to keep workers in their jobs. That this is a temporary suspension of activity. Again, I would highlight the increase to the HR costs, the recruitment costs, the retraining costs. Prior to Corona crisis, we were dealing with workers that have been phased out of the old economy in advanced economies in Europe and America, needing to be retrained and reskilled and upskilled to enter the new economy. You don't want a bunch of workers in the new economy also phased out of economic growth. So I think that just is absolutely important going forward. I think all bets are off in terms of keeping numbers steady at the moment, and with the hope for a firmer recovery going forward.
Hung, let me ask you the same question, and then we're also getting a lot of questions, your comments on the IMF resources. So if you can talk about that a little more. Basically what Doug Redeker and others are talking about is that the quotas were not increased this year. And in fact, the resources are set to be somewhat curtailed. So we know there's a provision now in the stimulus bill, but is that going to be enough? And what more would you like to see in terms of IMF resources? So those two questions for you, Hung.
Well, thank you very much. Number one, I fully agree with the previous speakers as to the trade-off between health and economy. However, I think that we should be paying more attention to more research and more instruction and guidance in terms of smart working, so as people can work but minimize the risk of infection or passing on infection. One example that I have seen in recent days is that delivery people, they come and just leave the package in front of your house and leave, and you come out and pick up, zero contact, but maintain a very important service that everyone needs now in terms of shelter at home. Number two, IMF resources. Yes, quota restrict the amount of SDR allocation that member countries receive, but at this point, reform and change quota system is I would say, quite unrealistic and not the right time to do it. And therefore, just go ahead and increase SDR 500 million based on current quotas. Unfortunately, 2/3 of that will be going to advanced countries and creditor EM countries like China, 1/3 to emerging market countries and to the low-income country. Last time around $30 billion. So very small, but better than nothing. The symbolic messaging is important in this case. What I really want to see is a very quick increase in the emergency financing capacity of the fund. The IFC just agreed to it today, and if the G20 government endorses it, it can be done quickly. And this kind of thing, quick, is important. And that leads me to the last point that Alexis raised. Increased IMF resources is important, but not enough. Because the crisis, in my view, this time is really not more of a natural economic policy mistake crisis in emerging market countries that require funds program to correct and to improve over time. It is a very short term, sometimes overnight, dollar liquidity funding crisis. And why it is coming up so strongly now is that beyond the three vulnerabilities that Alexis mentioned, which I fully agree, is the fact that non-US banks, that is banks outside of the US, both in Europe, Japan, emerging market countries, and so on, currently have about $13 trillion, can be more, a little bit more depending on how you count it, but $13+ trillion of liabilities outside of the US financial system. They don't have access to the Fed as a lender of last resort. And therefore, they rely on long-term funding, which can come due during the course of the year, and they may fail to roll over 100% of their medium to long-term funding. And they are extremely and critically depending on short-term funding in the foreign exchange cross-currency swap markets, which show signs of stress in the past few weeks. The swap line that the Fed did with the five advanced countries and then the four additional emerging market countries is really helpful, but they have limits. They are not infinite, and therefore we are still vulnerable to further stress in this market where banks may fail. Banks basically fail not because they have more liability than asset, not because of their insolvency, but because of lack of liquidity. And many non-US banks, including in Japan, including in Europe, are facing this US dollar funding need right now.
Thank you. It's a really important point on the swap lines and the liquidity issue. So I tried, and you brought up the Fed, Hung. I tried to focus mostly on fiscal. I wanted to be true to what Larry Summers talked about. The IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal, but I can no longer avoid talking about monetary policy. So Jason, let me turn to you. We were just looking at it at the Atlantic Council yesterday. It looks like about $4 trillion in various measures from the Fed over the last 3 weeks. If you look at what was done in the whole scope of 2008 to 2014, you could say it was about 4.5 trillion. So I guess the question is, the Fed has done an incredible amount in a short amount of time. Do they have the tools they need? What else would they need? And what else can they do in the days ahead? Or have they done their part and it's now more for Congress?
I think the Fed has done an extraordinary amount. I think they could purchase more treasuries if they needed to. They could do de facto yield control if that's needed in order to make fiscal policy work better. I think they could buy, take more onto their balance sheet, supply more liquidity, et cetera, to make sure markets are functioning. I think second, they now have something that's sort of a hybrid of monetary and fiscal policy where they have nearly $500 billion in capital. And that allows them to extend credit and financing in ways they never could have otherwise, effectively taking risks they wouldn't ordinarily be able to take. And finally, I would not devalue the importance of the World Central Bank's regulatory response to all of this. The need for things that normally I would think were terrible, like allowing banks to extend and pretend their loans, and being more tolerant around capital levels, at the same time being tough around dividends and share buybacks and the like. So I think a lot of the tone they set on regulation will matter, and I think they've done a lot of the right things there as well. But that's not going to show up in a balance sheet statement. It's going to show up in whether a bank feels they can lend knowing the central bank and the regulators have their backs, or whether they're nervous about that lending.
So one question we have for Jason, both you and Alexis, is how did policymakers respond to an economic crisis that can come in waves? We've, in some ways, you could say we saw that a little bit over the Obama administration, extended out. But this is going to be different and sharper waves potentially, given where the infections, hotspots, and decrease. So are policymakers and especially legislators equipped to deal with that kind of crisis? So Alexis, let me start with you and then go to Jason.
Thanks so much. I think it depends on how much coffee there's going around. I think at this moment, I just keep thinking about the GDP of cities, and I'm sitting in the largest city in America, in New York, and just thinking about the GDP. Going back to Jason's point about state and local governments weren't in a great fiscal position leading into the corona crisis. So I think that would be one to point out, is the more that you see cities hit. I've seen another piece on potential hits to Californian cities as well. I think that's going to be pretty dire. What is crucial that Jason highlighted is that miraculously, despite such a polarized, divided situation on the Hill, that this has come through so quickly. So that's going to be essential moving forward, that both sides of the House come together, both sides of the bench come together to be able to exact legislation going forward. I think you've seen some contention around, this potential fund to be able to help businesses. I think, again, that's going to be a question mark going forward. Something that I think should be palatable to people is this is not bailing out banks, which had a lot of stigma with, the left, and thinking about the 1%, et cetera. This is about bailing out the real economy, and bailing out blue collar workers effectively. So I think that's also going to be crucial going forward, is to what extent can we really maintain that connection point to be able to shore up the financial liquidity for companies that are designed to be able to keep their employers on staff. So I think that's going to be crucial. And of course, how the media portrays this going forward is going to be important. So I would just say that that essential piece of cohesion, coming together to serve humanity rather than one's own interests, is going to be absolutely important going forward.
So Jason, I'm curious for your thoughts on that. And I know you've said before, it's hard for policymakers, I think, to be innovative in a crisis. And it seems like a crisis that's going to require constant innovation over the next few months. So how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so the thing I was most disappointed about in the legislation is I would have liked to have seen triggers. that would automatically extend and expand various elements of the assistance as needed, in some cases at the national level, in some cases based on state conditions. I think that's important for two reasons. One, we just don't know how easy it will be for Congress to come back and vote again. I hope they switch to remote voting, but there's a lot of resistance to doing that. So how will they be able to legislate? And number two, I think we could easily have the appetite for another $2 trillion stimulus bill 2 months from now. A year from now, if our economy has a lot of problems, people will say, oh, we've already spent trillions. Why do we need to do any more? Or they may even say, oh, the problems were caused by the trillions we spent, as sort of like the person with a fever who thought the aspirin caused that they took caused their fever. And so I'm worried about a premature withdrawal of all of the types of things that are needed and are being done. And so triggers that extend and expand it can help in that regard too. In terms of creativity, I think we need both tried and true. A lot of what the Fed has done are tools they had in their toolkit already from last time. They just did them faster and bigger this time. It's hard to invent new things. A lot of them fail. The government is really not operating at 100% capacity right now, with people teleworking their children home and the like. So certainly I'm not against creativity. I'm in favor of a diversified response. I just wouldn't rely on any creative magic bullet genius idea to solve all our problems. I'd do a bunch of traditional boring stuff that we know works at least okay in addition.
Josh, can I have a comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually ask everyone, since we're almost out of time, and I'll start with you, Hung, for final comments, so you can respond to that. And then I just ask everyone as they wrap up to kind of come back to the fundamental question of this session of fiscal firepower, and is it enough? And thinking in a month from now, what will we look back and wish we will have done now? So if everyone could respond to that, we'll go Hung, Alexis, and then finish with Jason.
Thank you. Basically, back to the earlier question about the crisis coming in waves. Personally, I think definitely that will be the case. But that also means that the crisis, both human health crisis and economic crisis, is a bit long-term in nature. And the fear I have there is to be able to deal with the long-term challenge of that magnitude. Requires at least a degree of consensus in society, in the leadership, in terms of the nature of the challenge, and in terms of a long-term vision of where we are going from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 and beyond. We don't have that. And that is what really worries me. And then between the health crisis, the economic crisis, I fear that we can run into a social crisis with breakdown in social cohesion. Thank you.
And so, Alexis, let me turn to you as we wrap up this question of what we'd like to see a month from now happen now, and any concluding thoughts you have.
I think firstly would be to call out the overwhelming importance of addressing the health crisis, this concept of preserving per capita rather than per capita GDP. That's number one. And if we look back and say that things like herd immunity were impactful, I think are quickly dismissed. And I think people are going to want to look back and say that, particularly in the U.S. responses, that municipal and state authorities have done everything they can to be able to stop the health crisis. The second thing I would call out is that this is about Main Street, not Wall Street yet. I think it's about Main Street. And so the ways in which politicians, I would say both in Europe and America, actually communicate this to their people is going to be critically important. I think that there is a social crisis that predated the corona crisis in advanced economies, where people felt disenfranchised and that they had a loss of economic sovereignty, sometimes to central banks, sometimes to entities that were unelected. And I think now, critically, everyone is standing in, from what I can see, to be able to shore up the real economy. So the ways in which that is messaged and communicated is going to be crucially important. I think also to being able to secure the successive fiscal policy responses to the waves as they come. The other, I think, would be to be not overly optimistic again on this concept of a V-shaped recovery. You need to prepare people for the fact that this is an economic stop. It's not a financial stop, and that it's going to take a lot of time to recover, no matter what kind of tools we throw at the problem, no matter how impressive they are.
So thank you. Jason, I'll give you the last word. And I'll just ask you, in addition to concluding thoughts you have, based on what you've seen so far, do you think we've learned here in the US, at least, the right lessons from 2009 and what came after it?
Yeah, so I thought Hung Tran and Alexis just were beautiful, and everything they said, I agreed with every word of it. I think the hardest thing here is, economically, I think the good news is we do have fiscal space. We do have monetary space in the advanced economies. So economically, I don't think we can at all guarantee or promise a V-shaped recovery, but I think we can do quite a lot to minimize some of the economic suffering. What worries me is political will, the acrimony that might start setting in, the different sectors of society pitted against each other, and a fatigue with all of the response. So far, it's encouraging, but continuing to try to let our imagination understand just how large this is in a way that's so hard to comprehend. And I think yesterday's unemployment insurance claims helped in that regard is going to be really important. The thing I want to conclude on, though, is what I am more worried about is what the economic capacity is in emerging markets to respond to this, what the ability of their health systems to deal with this is. And it worries, coordination between the advanced economies right now, I think, is fine because they all have the same interest and they would all be doing what they were doing, even if the finance ministers weren't on the phone or Zoom with each other. There are somewhat different interests in emerging markets and advanced economies. It's hard to generate goodwill in the best of times, and these are not the best of times with advanced economies hunkered down. So I think the most important, biggest challenge for international cooperation is not, the Fed and the ECB. I'm not worried about that at all. It's, the United States, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, and how they handle what is, I think, a more worrying, even more worrying situation in the rest of the world.
Thank you. So I think on that note, what I would ask of everyone listening in our panel, maybe we could check back in a month and see where we are, if everyone's willing. And I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Fred and everyone at the Atlantic Council for hosting this. Obviously, it's an economic crisis and it's a health crisis at the same time, and they're deeply intertwined. We're going to be doing a lot more on it here at the Atlantic Council. So we hope you're all a part of it. We hope everyone stays healthy and stays safe. And thank you for joining today.